Thank you for giving me this chance to present my paper at the GFAIR. So actually, my paper is not only interested for people who are doing economics, but it's very important for anyone who are thinking what types of scale they should develop in order to be successful in the labor market, especially for the people who are living in advanced Asian economies. So let me tell you the last thing first, and it's that if women have the same opportunity to use their accumulated human capital as men do, the gender gap would be much smaller than what it is in the labor market. Based on my content, I'm going to talk about 7 things. The first one, let me introduce my paper related to, and also the motivation. Actually, you might know that gender disparity is a global challenge, but it has different picture in different countries. But human capital is being one of the essential driver of these gender disparities in the labor market. But there is a key challenge on how to exactly measure the human capital. Who has more human capital, who has less? Literature mainly rely on quantity-based measurement of human capital, which is educational attainment or years of schooling. But it's problematic because years of schooling may not reflect quality of education, ongoing skill adoption, and long life learning. Because based on the years of schooling, you may treat the people who graduate from MIT exactly the same as the people who graduate from RMIT in Vietnam. Because just they measure the number of years of schooling that you stay in the school. So there's a different way to measure the stock of human capital to assess adult skill directly, rather than to proxy based on the years of schooling. So fortunately, the PIOC data, which is a program for international adult assessment competencies, provide this chance to evaluate directly the human capital or human skill level in OECD and some other OECD partner countries. Based on that, we designed our objective for this paper first to compare wage and employment return to cognitive skill in Japan, Korea, and Singapore using PIOC, which they are advanced member of the PIOC dataset. We don't have other advanced member in this dataset rather than these 3 countries. And also the second thing we are going to do, analyze factor behind gender wage and employability gap within and across these 3 countries. So what motivation comes from? To better understand the distinct and overlapping factors that drive gender disparities in wage and also employability from a multidimensional human capital perspective in 3 advanced Asian economies, focusing on the double impact of cognitive skills. So let me tell you some literature review related to my paper. The first thing, which is related to the skill measurement or the measurement of skill. Much of literature uses educational attainment or years of schooling as a proxy for measuring people's skill or human capital, but some studies suggest that educational outcome, which is cognitive skill people have learned, not how much you stay in the school, are more reliable proxies of human capital than just attainment, how long people have stayed in school. It's important how much you have rather than how much you stay in the class. So there are some other literature that confirm this idea. And also when it comes to the skill effect, rather than the human capital, which is based on the years of schooling effect. So what people know and can do matters for labor market success, which is cognitive abilities are strongly linked to people earning and better employment. Actually, earning and better employment in terms of economics, they're related to mostly microeconomic level. But when it comes to income distribution and overall economic growth, they are macroeconomic level. So it means cognitive skill affect also on microeconomic level, which is on people level, and also on macroeconomic level, which is overall the general economic. And also when it comes to the effect on gender disparities in the labor market, cognitive numeracy skills, I mean mostly mathematical based skills, are crucial for explaining a significant part of the gender gap in the labor market, both in terms of wages and also labor market participation. It means if you have more numerical skill, you have more chance to get higher earning in the labor market and higher probability or possibility to be employed in a good job. So in addition, differences in skill utilization, how much you use actually your skill in the labor market, because sometimes you have something, but you do not have the chance to use that. So it's much more important to have the chance to use that. So in this case, differences in skill utilization explain the persistent gender wage gap in the countries where the wage penalty of females is substantial. So it means if you have something, especially for female case or for women, but you do not have the chance to use in the labor market, so it means you don't have the chance to earn much. So our contribution in this research is 5 factors. The first one, we uniquely contrast 2 forms of gender disparities, which is qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative, we mean wage level, and quantitative, we means employment level. Because when it comes to employment, it's just consider whether you are employed or not. But in terms of qualitative, which is wage, is considered how much exactly you earn. It doesn't only matter that you're working or not. It's matter how much you're earning in the labor market. And basically, we are going to do a dual focus approach. And at the same time, to focus both on quantitative and qualitative to see whether there's a link between these two or not. And secondly, we are going to provide some insight specific to the socio-economic context of each nation, specifically 3 advanced Asian economies, which I mentioned before. And also we are going to do how gender disparities evolve over the life cycle and different scale level, which is we are going to do age-specific and scale-specific analysis in this paper. And the fourth one, we use Gilbert decomposition, which is a new decomposition in the labor market to decompose any gap that we have. And finally, the other contribution that we may suggest is that a one-size-fits-all policy approach may not be effective. It means we are going to provide cause-specific policy adoption rather than to provide one policy for the whole country. So let's provide some empirical strategies for our research. First of all, we are using some simple OLS, ordinary least square regression, based on this formula, which is mostly in this formula in other conventional method. And instead of cognitive scale, instead of this one, mostly we have the years of schooling. But in this formula, instead of years of schooling, we have cognitive scale, because we are measuring the return to cognitive scale rather than years of schooling, which is a measurement of, as a kind of quantity measurement of human capital. And also, in order to provide how the gender wage and also gender wage gap evolve over the different distribution of income, we use the quantile regression. But in our OLS formula, there is a kind of bias, and that bias comes from 3 different sources: measurement error, reverse causality, and omitted variable. Thus, after using OLS and quantile regression, we are going to approach some instrumental variable using the 2-stage least square, first stage and second stage. For the case of measurement error, literacy is a kind of IV or instrumental variable for our numeracy scales. Years of schooling is an IV for the reverse causality. And in case of omitted variable bias, we add parental education and health status in order to see whether there's some other factors that at the same time affect both on wages or both on employability and also skills. And in order to decompose the wage gap and employability gap, we are going to use the Gilbert decomposition. In the case of Gilbert decomposition, we decompose the gender wage gap and employment gap to some demographic factor, demographic characteristics, accumulated human capital, and human capital use. So we are going to group each factors, how much they contribute to explaining the gender gap in the labor market. So when it comes to data on descriptive statistic, data comes from the OECD, which is based on the PIOC measurement or PIOC survey. And the PIOC mainly focus on 3 main domain assessment of cognitive skill, which is literacy, numeracy, problem solving, and technological rich environment. But mostly we rely on numeracy because literacy may affect by differences in language. Because in the same country, maybe people from different language, they live, but the questionnaire provided in English. So they may have some problem on analyzing the text. But mostly we use numerical scale as a measurement here, but literacy and problem solving can be used, and we are using that one for the robustness case. And we, as I said, we only focus out of 39 OECD and OECD partner countries only on 3 advanced Asian countries. Why the other are not? Because other of mostly European economies, which they have some similar characteristic, which already those people done the research for these countries, and also USA, Canada, Australia. But we rather focus on Asian countries, what is going on in Asia, rather than what is going on in Europe or in Australia or UK and USA. So here is a descriptive statistic. In the descriptive statistic, you know that there is a large gender wage gap in all 3 countries, but mostly in Japan is much larger. And also large employment gap. Again, the employment gap is much larger in case of South Korea. And there is a large gap in numerical scale, especially in Singapore, after in Japan, and then in Korea. And also in all of the factors that you see here, there are gender gap. Especially another factor is experience. There is a large gap in experience, especially in South Korea. Although when you see the age is not so much different, 40.52, 40.60, but the gap in experience is almost like 6.5 years. There's too much gap in experience, but there's no gap in age. So when it comes to empirical finding, first of all, the return to cognitive skill in terms of wages is much larger in terms of employability. You see the effect on wages, 15%, 16%, almost 40%, but in terms of employability on the 2, 3, and 5%. The second thing, there is a large gender wage gap in Japan and also in Korea, but lower gender wage gap in Singapore and also lower employment gap in Singapore. So we see that basically Singapore is doing better in terms of return to cognitive skill, and also in terms of reducing the gender disparity, both in terms of employability and also in terms of wages. So here is the age-based analysis. One of the messages that I'm going to provide here is that larger employability gap in this younger age in Japan and Korea leads to larger wage gap in the next stage of life. Because the larger employability gap leads to the larger experience gap. And in the next stage, larger experience gap leads to the larger wage gap. Again, in Singapore, you see that relationship does not exist. But either in Singapore, the gap in the younger age even is in the advantage of female. So it means younger female in Singapore, they have more chance to work. They have more chance to earn more wages than male in the labor market. So the next thing, when it comes to skill level, again, in terms of skill level, we suppose that maybe higher skilled people in Japan and also in Korea, they may not show large gender wage gap and also employability gap, but still, the gender wage gap, you see the female here, the gender wage gap and employability gap increase over the skill level. Higher skill, higher gap. So it's basically higher skilled women do not have the better chance to work in a good job and do not have the better chance to earn more and to be employed more. But in terms of Singapore, it's not so much big. But rather in terms of Singapore, you see for the lower skill is larger, because in the Singapore, like mostly lower skill job is mostly male dominant job rather than female. We will see later on. So here is the results of alternative identification model based on the IV for measurement error and also for the reverse causality and for omitted variable bias. It's so complicated, we will move on. So when it comes to the gender gap decomposition, here is the gender gap decomposition result. For the wage gap decomposition is based on demographic factors, accumulated human capital, and human capital use. Accumulated human capital come from years of schooling, experience, numeracy skill, and literacy skill. But human capital use stands for use of numeracy, use of literacy, use of computer, use of non-cognitive skill, and use of problem-solving skill at work. You see that especially in case of Korea, Human capital use, the effect of human capital use on explaining the gender wage gap is much larger than accumulated human capital. It means females do not have the chance to use their skill, although they have. And also, the next, in terms of Japan, is also large, but is a little bit different. But when it comes to Singapore, the gap in accumulated human capital dominant rather than human capital use. Because in Singapore, human capital, people have the chance to use their human capital. So there is no big gap in human capital use in the labor market. But in terms of gender employment gap, only we focus on accumulated human capital and demographic profile, because you see that use of these factors at work. And where you are unemployed, it means you're not at work, then you are not using them. But rather, gender wage gap only come from the accumulated human capital in terms of employment. You see the gap in experience explain the largest part of gender employment gap, both in Japan and Korea, although in Singapore is large, but not that much large. So it means there is the experience gap. Mostly in the labor market, when you go to interview, they ask, how much experience do you have? This is the first question. So that's why when females do not have that much experience, so do not have that much chance to be employed in the labor market. And also when it comes to the detail of the accumulated human capital use, you see the use of literacy scale in the labor market, they explain a bigger portion of the gender gap in wage. And non-cognitive scale is the next factor, and experience still is large. So that one is still the same thing. And also mechanism is why you know that Singapore is indeed do well. Why is Korea does not do well? Because in terms of employability of female in Korea, we have some M-shaped type. It means people in this category of age, they move out from the labor market, especially female, in order to get married, to have children, and to raise their children. But in Singapore, we do not have that situation, because in Singapore, the raising children or the kind of child care fee or support is very low. So they do not need to worry about. So that's why Korea is not doing well. So in terms of gender gap in the labor force participation, still South Korea is doing bad, the kind of. In terms of portion of female in management position, again, Korea is not in a good situation. In terms of women share in vulnerable employment, again, Korea is not in good situation. According to the gender wage gap, again, Korea is not in good situation. According to the fertility rate, you see the fertility rate is getting too low. And after 2016, you see the gender wage gap in Korea is getting lower. Why? Because the fertility rate is getting lower. More female, they try to be in the labor market and they do not want to have children. So this is another problem. Although the gender wage gap is a bit getting lower, but on the price of getting too much low of fertility rate. So in conclusion, we did a double focus approach, both on the same time. We focus on employability and wage. And also, I want to say a message, quantity plus quantity is equal to quality. It means employment, how long you stay in the labor market, plus experience that you gain, it leads to better wage in the labor market. And also accumulated human capital use is a big factor that explains the gender wage gap and gender employability gap in the labor market. Singapore indeed is doing better both in terms of return and disparity, but Korea is vice versa. So finally, we should suggest some cause-specific policy too in the labor market in order to get rid of that long and larger gender disparities, especially in Korea that we are living here. Thank you.